Hi guys, it's Erin, and today I'm going to do my January wrap-up slash what I'm reading now. So like I said in my December wrap-up, my plan is instead of doing a wrap-up and then a TBR, which is kind of a pointless video to make because I have no idea how many books I am going to be able to get to over the next couple of months while this school semester is happening. I'm just going to show you a couple of books that I'm in the middle of or really looking forward to getting to at the end of my wrap-up. And then I also will often share on Instagram what I am currently reading, so if you're curious about what I'm reading and you don't already follow me on Instagram, you can run over there and do that. My information is in the description below. I finished 16 books in January, which is pretty good. It's definitely the best reading month I'm going to have for a while, and that's mostly just because I was on winter break until after Martin Luther King Jr. Day, so pretty much the first 3 weeks of January I was doing nothing, so I had lots of time to read. So because there's 16 books, that's a lot. I'm gonna go through these in varying levels of detail. Some of them I'm just gonna tell you that I read them and like a thing or two. A couple of them I might talk about a little bit more in depth, but I don't want this video to be 7 million years long, so that's how we're gonna do it. So the first book I finished in January was The Summer Tree by Gavriel, and I'm also going to talk about The Wandering Fire, which is book 2. I finished The Wandering Fire just a couple of days ago. Even though I finished the second book later than the first one, I am still going to talk about them both at the same time. This is a trilogy. Actually, I have the third book, but I just haven't had the chance to start it yet, and it is called The Finnevar Tapestry. And I heard about this from some list of like great fantasy books that you should read or something. I don't remember where I found it, but anyway, the premise sounded interesting enough that I put it on my Goodreads TBR, and then when I was scrolling through looking for books that I might want to buy with Christmas money, this popped up, and so I bought the first book, and I think I was about halfway through book 1 when I realized that I really needed books 2 and 3 right away, so I ordered them too. And that kind of gives you a hint of what I feel about this series, at least so far, which is that I really loved it. One of the things that attracted me to trying this series is that Gavriel actually worked with Christopher Tolkien to help him edit his father's writing into what we know as the Silmarillion, and I was in that, that's cool. And so this is definitely written in the tradition of Tolkien's kind of fantasy, but it's very unique. Like, you can see how he was influenced by The Lord of the Rings, but he's doing something completely different. It's in no way derivative, which I really like. This fantasy world, Finnevar, you can see is influenced pretty strongly by both Celtic, Welsh, and Norse mythology, and it's a really interesting mix that just kind of is like weird but also somehow makes sense. So at the beginning of the book, 5 like 20-something young adults, several of whom are in law school, so like grad student age, get approached by this man who's like, hey, P.S. I am a mage and I would like to take you to my realm of Finnevar because our king is celebrating the 50th anniversary of his being crowned king, and I said that I would do this. He's not being totally honest, and he kind of knows it, and he kind of feels bad that he's not being totally honest, but he does it anyway. And all of these young, it's a couple of them are a little skeptical, but it's everybody or nobody, and so they all agree to go. They think it's going to be kind of a fun adventure, and then they can go home. And it is for quite a while, actually. And then, of course, because it's a fantasy trilogy, the stable world is suddenly becomes unstable, and they have to work to help fix things. I feel like because it takes a while for the plot to get going, to say anything more than that would be really spoilery. What I like about the story is that the protagonists are older. This is definitely like more mature, but it's never graphic. So some like pretty awful things happen, trigger warning for rape in this book, but it is never described, so you only get told just enough to know what's happening. Kay is much more interested in the psychological impacts of the event on his characters than any event on his characters than he is about the like physically describing what's happening. I thought that the world was really creative. All of the characters are really interesting. I love them all so much. The good ones anyway. It's very much a black and white, good and bad world. I really should just probably make a video when I finish this to keep rambling, but those are some of the reasons that I really like it. It's something that as I'm reading it, I keep thinking like, yes, this is what I've been looking for in a fantasy series, and I just haven't found in a really long time. So very exciting. Book 2 follows book 1 and deals with the aftermath of the stuff that happens in book 1 as book 2s do. I will say, in respect to this book, a lot of times the second book in a trilogy is kind of but this one was equally good. I gave them both 5 stars, and I felt like it did a good job of avoiding the middle book slump. Like, it tied up things that happened in the first book, but introduced plenty of things to be happening in the second book, but had its own arc within it anyway. I like it a lot. So after a 5-star start, had a little bit of a... I read The Clockmaker's Daughter by Kate Morton. This was a book of the month book pick, and I have since found out that Kate Morton has like a following. I didn't know that, but kind of. So this is a story about this woman named Elodie Winslow, and she is an archivist, and she is digging through some donated materials to the archive that's related to this like imaginary Victorian age era philanthropist, and she's not sure, first of all, what this material has to do with the guy that her archive focuses on, and then also inside the box is a sketchbook that has a picture of a house that she recognizes from a family story that she got told as a child, like a fairy tale. She thought it was fake. So she starts to investigate kind of what was going on there. And then we get another timeline, or several other timelines, centering around the house, starting with a man named Edward Radcliffe, who was the artist who drew the house in the sketchbook, and about the tragedy that happened there, and then about the kind of like aftermath, and everything sort of twines together. And apparently that's kind of Kate Morton's thing. I do actually like stories like that, but I didn't feel like this one was particularly impressive, maybe because I've just read so many stories like that, and I have read stories that do a lot more interesting things with complex linear narratives. So I enjoyed it while I was reading it. What did I give it? Yeah, I didn't want to put it down, but I only gave it 3 stars, and it was maybe like 2.5. I keep forgetting that I've read it, so that says a lot to me. So last fall, I started rereading the Lord of the Rings trilogy by listening to it on audiobook, which took quite a while, but was a really great experience. It was kind of like experiencing the books as a reread, and also for the first time. Listening to it on audio for the first time was just a different experience, and I really enjoyed that. So I did not finish The Return of the King until this year, and I think I was so close. I just had a few hours left, but I listened to The Return of the King and finished it. I gave it 5 stars. It has a permanent 5-star rating. It will never not have 5 stars. I can't say anything that happens in it because it would spoil things. One thing that I noticed in this reading is how the first half of the Lord of the Rings, or the Return of the King especially, is really interested in hope versus despair, which I hadn't really picked up on before. But what do you do when everything seems like it's absolutely for sure gonna fall apart? How do you react to that? Like, what is the right reaction to that? It seems to be things that Tolkien is thinking about in this part of the story. So anyway, it's my favorite series of all time. Favorite book of all time, whatever. This was something else I started in December. It's called Waiting on the Word by Malcolm Guite, and it's a devotional for Advent, Christmas, and Epiphany, so basically from December 1st to January 6th, and each day there's a poem and then a little bit of a reflection on the poem about Christmas and about the season and stuff like that. I really like this. I gave it 5 stars. This is the first time I've read all of it. I had it last year, but I wasn't very faithful with it last year, but this year I read all of it and I really liked it. I felt like it was a really great way to get because he pulls poetry from all kinds of different writers and places, so some very contemporary poems, some very old poems, and his reflections are kind of like analyses. He's kind of analyzing each poem just very briefly. It was a pleasant way to experience, just kind of like get to read these poems with this writer, Malcolm Guite, and it kind of like really definitely put me in the mood for Christmas. The next book I finished was from the library. It was The Bear and the Serpent by Adrian Tchaikovsky. This is the second book in a series. I don't know what it's called. So the trilogy is called Echoes of the Fall. It's the second book in the trilogy. It picks up kind of after the events of the first book. Manier and Asmander, the main characters from the first book, continue to work together and also to kind of work out like what is going on in their lives, and their character trajectories continue. And then one of the characters, a bear named Loud Thunder, who we meet in the first book, gets picked by the leader of their tribe to become kind of a leader to try to bring together the tribes in the north against some kind of undefined threat that is going to come against them all. And he works to do that, and they start to understand what the threat is. I rated this 3 stars, and that seems pretty fair. I enjoyed reading this. I read it a lot faster than the first book, and I still really love the fantasy world. I think it's really creative and fascinating. It has this kind of Native American vibe to it. The culture is very tribal, and you can just like feel, but it's so well thought through and so incredibly well executed. It's fantastic. I feel like the characterization is not quite as well done, and that seemed to be kind of a problem in this book especially. And then also I could it's starting to feel sort of like it's going to be a pre-colonial, like a colonialization fable, and I don't know like if I care as much actually at that point. Like obviously I think colonialization, like we should talk about it, but I don't know, like I don't know if I wanted the conflict in the world to be that. I think there's a lot more interesting places that he could have gone, and it felt a little bit like a cop-out. But I'm still gonna read the 3rd book eventually. I might read it next January, just like because I read the first one in 2018. I don't know. Then I read a nonfiction book called Paul in Fresh Perspective by N.T. Wright. This was really, really fascinating. It's a very slim book, and it was written after he gave a series of lectures at Cambridge, and so each chapter is just about 20 pages, and it was easy to read like one chapter in a sitting, which I really appreciated. If you're at all interested in St. Paul and how to look at the life and teachings of St. Paul, I would definitely recommend this book. There's 8 main chapters. In the first 4 chapters, Wright looks at several different significant worldviews and kind of like historical and cultural things that were going on that influenced Paul and his writing, and tries to kind of situate Paul in that time. And then he looks at several major things that Paul wrote about, like several of Paul's major themes, and looked at how they fit in light of those historical and cultural and societal kind of like paradigms. I found that it just gave me a much better perspective of what life in early 1st century was like, and it gave me a better perspective of why Paul says the kinds of things that he says and what he's doing. N.T. Wright, if you didn't know, is a New Testament historian and theologian who has spent most of his, like a good portion of his work writing on Paul in particular, so he is very knowledgeable, and I liked his approach, which was very academic. I give this 4 stars just because I'm trying to save my 5 stars and be a little bit more broad ranged in my ratings. Like honestly, I probably should give The Clockmaker's Daughter 2.5 stars. This would be probably like 4.5. I'm saving the 5 stars for the books that I just adored, that made my heart sing. I don't want to overrate books anymore. So the next book I read was Virgil Wander by Leif Enger. This was just so charming and delightful. Virgil Wander is the name of a man. He lives in a small town in Minnesota on the shores of Lake Superior, and he works part-time as the county clerk, or the city clerk, and part-time at this old like vintage theater, which is what's lit up here. One day he is driving home after photographing a storm that kind of like formed over Lake Superior, and in the bad weather he slips off the road and plunges into the lake. He wakes up from a lot of medical problems a little bit later and finds that due to the brain damage he is seeing life a little bit differently. And around the same time, this old man from Norway named, Rune. Rune is this really charming and delightful man. He loves to fly kites and makes these really creative, really beautiful ones. And he's there because he's found out that his biological son is from the town, and he never knew that he had this biological son, and comes to find out more about him because it turns out the son went missing a long time ago. This makes it sound almost like it's a mystery thriller, and I did wonder if it was going in that direction sometimes, but it's definitely more just like a celebration of community and how all of these like small little changes in Virgil and in Rune's appearance come together to help just kind of like make the town better and make the town's life, the people in the town, the life of the people in the town better. It was an old like mining town that kind of went defunct, and it's really run down, and they start to figure out how they might draw people in and back to it. It was really lovely. It had a slight magical realism turn, and I don't know if it was as deftly done as it could be. I wasn't sure if it was magical realism or realism, and so because it's very, very subtle, once I got to the end, I realized kind of looking back that it was definitely supposed to be magical realism, so maybe knowing that going in would be helpful. Like I said, the book doesn't seem quite sure of its genre. It could have become a thriller, but it doesn't. So I gave it 4 stars, but I really enjoyed it. I would definitely recommend it if you just want a delightful story about really interesting people and the ways that they help each other. Next, I finished Adam Bede. I did an entire video about this, so all I'm going to say is I gave it 5 stars, and it was wonderful, and you should go watch the video if you want to know anything else about that. This was the first classic that I finished this year, and it was a great one to start off with. Okay, next I finished How Not to Be Secular by James K. Smith. This is kind of like summary / analysis of The Secular Age by Charles Taylor. Smith says in his introduction that he read The Secular Age and felt like it was a really valuable explanation of like how we got to where we are in our culture, and he felt also like the 900 or something page book by Charles Taylor was maybe not something that everyone would find accessible, so he wanted to write a very thin book that kind of covered the major points of Taylor's argument, and could at least let people know if they wanted to read the whole book or not. In that sense, it worked very well because I definitely would like to read Taylor's book. I think it was fascinating. The argument that he presents is fascinating. He goes back to the Middle Ages and talks about the worldview and the kind of like cultural atmosphere of the Middle Ages, and then explores how different things have changed since then that have led us to our own beliefs in our own present time. And I think it's really interesting because it just shows how all of the things that are going on right now are very deeply rooted in things that happened several hundred years ago. If that's true, then at least in my opinion, I think it's really valuable to understand how the progression happened so that we can maybe try to change it, do something different, recognize that this isn't like the inevitable solution. This is the solution that was brought on by a bunch of different choices over the last 500 years, and that we could shape the future to be something different or better. Hopefully better. If you're curious about any of that, I would definitely recommend checking out this first, and then maybe Charles Taylor's book. Then I finished a book for school. This is called Orality and Literacy by Walter Ong, and Ong looks at the different cultural and narrative differences between an oral culture and a literate culture, and specifically a culture that is completely oral, that has no experience or knowledge of the written word, and a very literate culture. And he looks at how those actually produce different kinds of thoughts because of the way that we organize our thoughts, and shows just like how very shaped we are by the written word. It was really interesting. It's a little dense at times, but just fascinating, and you can easily find used copies. It's not super long, and so if that sounds something that is interesting, maybe check it out. It's definitely accessible if you're willing to kind of plod a little bit. I didn't rate that because it was a school book, but I did like it. The next thing I finished was a book called Winterhued by E.H. Alger. This is an indie published fantasy that I found out about because a friend read it and rated it on Goodreads. It's actually quite long. It was almost 500 pages, but so beautiful. It was just this like gentle fairy tale. It was a fairy tale too, not a fantasy. It felt very old-fashioned, Even the language was kind of old-fashioned on purpose, and it was very well done, and I thought it was quite lovely. So it's about a girl named Winterhued. She's a princess, and it took me a little bit to figure this out, but she's actually much older. She's definitely at least in her 30s. And Princess Winterhued is the only daughter of her widowed, or the only child of her widowed father, and she is both the heir to the throne and pretty much the one who's running the kingdom at this point. But her father is really, like, kind of a jerk, and he's definitely misogynistic, and he really, like, begrudges the fact that she is going to rule, and he's starting to talk about maybe marrying some young woman, both because he likes the idea of marrying a young woman, and because he's like, well, then I could have a son and you wouldn't rule. Completely ignoring the fact that his kingdom would have fallen apart ages ago if it wasn't for his daughter. Winterhued is very good and kind, but not saccharine, which is, I think, also something that is easy to do wrong, but is done really well. And there's a reason behind her goodness, which I won't spoil. The plot really kicks off when a dragon comes to the castle and decides to settle in. We also follow this knight, the best knight in the land, who has been a kind of wandering fighter for a long time, and this two storylines flip-flop, and then we see how they intervene. I thought it was a really lovely and, like I said, charming story, and it's one that I still think about. I will definitely buy the book when I have the chance. I got it at my library. I gave it 5 stars. The next book I finished was The Shadow of the Fox by Julie, I think it's Kagawa. I enjoyed this. I gave it 3 stars, which means that I liked it, but I didn't feel like it was anything particularly, like, brilliant. I really liked, it's based on Japanese folklore and mythology, which I really loved. I loved the setting. It was quite different, and it was kind of fun to learn about the different Japanese inspired things, but ultimately it was fine. A little predictable, cute. It was like the typical YA fantasy. Then I read the Orestea. This is by Aeschylus. This is the first complete Greek dramatic trilogy, and it's some of the oldest Greek drama that we have that exists. So therefore some of the oldest Western drama that we have that exists. This is about this myth where King Agamemnon gets home from the Trojan War, and his wife Clytemnestra and her lover conspire to kill Agamemnon because reasons, and then their son Orestes must revenge his mother, but then in order to revenge his father's death, he has to kill his mother, which brings down the Furies on him. It's this whole thing. Greek drama, man. It's a mess. But anyway, this play was really interesting. I am interested in reading about how other people have written about reading and why we read, so I have started to read a handful of books that I've heard about. The first one is on Reading Well by Karen Swallow Prior, and this is on finding the good life through great books, and Prior goes through a series of different virtues like patience and humility and charity and justice, things like that. And with each one of the virtues, she explores like what the virtue is classically, and then how we can see that virtue through a particular work of literature. She looks at a really broad range of literature, everything from 18th century novels like Tom Jones to Cormac McCarthy's The Road, which was published in like 2000. I really enjoyed both her discussions of the virtues and her discussions of the books and how they kind of related to each other. It was very interesting. I gave it 5 stars. And then the last book was I'd Rather Be Reading by Bogel. The subtitle to this is The Delights and Dilemmas of the Reading Life, and that is basically what it is. It was a series of 21 very short chapters that just focused on some kind of delight or dilemma of the reading life. It was itself a very delightful book. I would love to have a copy of this also. It would be a great like coffee table book or bed, like nightstand book. It's really pretty for one thing, and you could definitely just leave it out on display. One of those great books that if you just want a little pick-me-up, a little moment with somebody who understands what it's like to be a reader, it would be great to just like pick up and read a chapter. They're kind of like mini little essays, not like a continuous narrative or argument or anything, so you could definitely read it in tiny little pieces. It's only like, it's not even 150 pages long, and it's a small book. It's only like this big. So those were the 16 books that I read in January. If I didn't talk very much about one of the books that you would like to know more about, feel free to ask about it in the comments, and I'll put the list of titles and authors in the description box, so you can also just like go check out the synopsis or whatever on Goodreads. We interrupt your regularly scheduled programming for a time jump. I filmed most of the wrap up and TBR video just like an hour and a half ago, and the sun has since set, which is why we have changed the angle and the lighting is different. But I realized that I didn't actually do my February what I'm reading now well, and also I left out a book, so we're gonna do it again. Anyway, life happens. So 2 books that I'm reading now and 2 books that I would like to read in February. The first book I'm reading now is a young adult novel called The Gilded Wolves by Roshni Chokshi, I think is how it's pronounced, Roshni Chokshi. This is a story about a group of teens who have lots of talents and who do this like big heist. It's set in Paris during the Gilded Age, which is like the late 1800s, but there's magic in the world. It's fun, I'm enjoying it. This is my nightstand book, so it's a book that I just leave on my bedside table, and on the nights when I'm tired and I want to read for a little while to kind of just rev the life engine down before I go to bed, but I don't want a book that's going to either get super like intense and rev the engines up again, or one that I am like so absorbed in I can't put down. I picked this one up. The other book that I'm in the middle of right now is Eleanor Oliphant is Completely Fine. This is about a woman named Eleanor Oliphant, and we get introduced to her routine and her life at the beginning of the book. She narrates it. It's very regular, it's very routine, and it's very lonely. It's lonely for a couple, like we start to realize why it's lonely. It's lonely because Eleanor is one of those people that's very blunt and also very, very practical and doesn't quite understand social nuance. And so it's just hard for her to relate to people. And then we also start to learn that she has had some very traumatic experiences in her childhood and probably some abusive ones. At least that's what's slowly unfolding as she's telling us her story. But not too far into the book, this very regular life starts to get disrupted. First because she meets her company's new IT guy, a guy named Raymond, when he has to come fix her computer. And then they end up helping an old man who has a heart attack on the street, and they get drawn into the life of him and his family. And so as Eleanor kind of gets drawn out into society and gets shown really genuine love and starts to build a community, things change for her. I'm really interested in communities right now, like the vital human need we all have for a supportive, loving community. And that's what really drew me to this book, and I am really loving it so far. 2 books that I would like to get to. The first one is The Light We Cannot See by Anthony Doerr. I have been meaning to read this like literally since it came out. And then it won the National Book Award, and I still wanted to read it and didn't, and then it came out in paperback, and I still wanted to read it and didn't, and I have it in my possession now. This is the closest I've come so far to reading it, but it's really long, and I don't know if I'm gonna have time, just because this is a short month and because I have a lot of work for school. This is about 2 children who are having very different experiences during World War II. And then the last book that I really, really want to get to this year is Hannah Coulter by Wendell Berry. I've been hearing amazing things about Hannah Coulter for a long time, and it's really short. This is, from what I understand, about Hannah Coulter, and she is an old woman looking back on her life and her life experiences and kind of reflecting on them. And I've been hearing really great things about this book, and hearing that it is, although it's slim, it packs a really big punch and is, for some people, a really important book just to them and for the way that they look at life. And so I bought it 2 months ago, and it's just been sitting on my shelf waiting for the right time, and I think the right time is soon. So this might be, I'm not sure whether I'm going to pick up this one or All the Light We Cannot See when I finish Eleanor Oliphant, but that's kind of like my mini TBR. Those are the 2 books that I want to get to when I'm finished reading the ones that I am currently reading. And now back to the past. So Those are the books that I read in January and the ones that I am reading now. I would love to hear what your favorite book that you read last month was, and also what you are reading now or what you are excited to get to. And thanks for watching all the way to the end of this very, very long video, and I will see you in my next one. Bye!